A little while ago, I published a video that showed how I started using NX for one of my main projects and how it made my workflow way more efficient. So I'll link to that video if you want to check it out. But this was shortly after I first started using NX and I hadn't yet refactored the codebase to use the full NX best practice approach. I only had one shared UI library to share code among multiple apps, but the recommended approach is to have almost all of your code in libraries. And the apps themselves are just lightweight shells which import everything from the libraries. So I've already released a video that covers the general concept of this library approach, so I'll link to that as well if you are not sure what that might look like. The point of this video is to provide a high-level overview of what it looks like to refactor a normal application into this hardcore NX library approach, and show why it is worthwhile in the context of this specific project. So for a bit of context, the project in question is an NX workspace that contains the Gatsby React sites that I maintain. I think it makes for a good example because it's a kind of scrappy real-world project that I've been maintaining in one form or another all the way back to around 2015 when it was a single WordPress blog. So this refactor has been a chance to finally address the technical debt that has accumulated over the years. I could probably talk about what I did for this refactor for hours, but I'm just going to give you a quick bird's eye view of the process I took step by step with a bit of commentary along the way. So the first step was to get the app or apps into the mono repo. The first few steps I'd already completed back when I filmed that first video. And so step one was just getting my existing project inside of the NX workspace, which basically just consisted of me dumping my code inside of an app that I had generated in this workspace. And at this point, the code worked just as it did before. It's just now living inside of an NX workspace monorepo. There isn't really much difference here, but even still, this does provide access to the NX tooling. And then step two was to pull out the shared UI into a shared UI library. So one of my main motivations initially for using a monorepo was that I knew I could share a lot of code between my apps. So the first thing I did was create a shared UI library with NX, and then I started pulling code out from my main app into components within this library. And then once they had been refactored into this library, I then re-imported those back into the apps that needed to use them. So this did immediately provide a lot of benefit to me, but it's not a particularly organized way to go about this. As you can see, I've kind of just used this as a dumping ground for a bunch of different UI components that I'm using throughout my apps. And so the next step after that was to create some custom executors and generators. Now we could create those in this same monorepo. In my case, I actually have this in a separate monorepo that I'm using for plugins and things like that. So you can see in this package.json, I've got two packages here that I'm using. So I've got a Gatsby template generator that will allow me to quickly generate a new Gatsby site on some pre-existing template I've defined. So that removes a lot of the setup work I need to do. And I created a plugin for deploying my sites to Netlify. So this is an executor that will build and then deploy to Netlify for me. And this is really cool because I can just run the one command and I can deploy any individual app that exists within my monorepo to Netlify. It's going to deploy it, do a production build just with that single command. Okay, so this is where we get into the new stuff, the stuff that I did after that previous video. So I was pretty stoked with everything I had implemented so far. As I mentioned, I wasn't really using the best practice NX approach. I'd been doing a lot of stuff with NX and Angular, and I was really enjoying architecting applications properly with NX. So I wanted to incorporate that into my existing sites workspace. So step 4 of this process was to go all out with the library approach. And the NX approach of putting everything into libraries kind of makes things a little bit easy because you don't need to think too much about what should go into libraries and what shouldn't, because pretty much everything does go into libraries. Our application itself will just be the sort of bare minimum amount of code we need to set up the app. With this particular Gatsby site, I was pretty much able to remove everything but this one component here. These are just my AWS Lambda functions and some GraphQL fragments, but all the rest of the functionality for this site is being imported from the libraries. So what I did at this stage was I refactored as much as possible from one of my sites. So I picked the Elite Ionic one to start off with, and I just started moving everything over into libraries. So whenever it was obvious that something could be shared with other apps, I would add that to this shared grouping folder, libraries within this shared grouping folder. But otherwise, I just added it to a library specific to Elite Ionic. So we have this Elite Ionic grouping folder, and within that, we have all of the Elite Ionic libraries. And again, we're using that sort of best practice NX structure. So we kind of have this broken down into features. So I have all of the libraries related to articles in here. So that's another grouping folder. And then we have a UI library and a data access library. And that's repeated for pretty much every feature here. We have modules, data access UI. Same again for the pages, data access and UI. We have a shared grouping folder, and this is for stuff that is shared just among the Elite Ionic application itself. And then we have the more general shared folder, which is to be used between multiple different applications. So the end goal here was basically to have the app working exactly the same as it was before, except now the code would be coming from libraries, not the app. And so you might wonder about the point of this. Why refactor everything out into libraries if it is just the one project that is going to be using it anyway? Anything inside of this Elite Ionic folder is only going to be used by the Elite Ionic app, so why even put it here in the first place? So there are rather concrete reasons to do this, and a big one being that with the way NX statically analyzes your code base and caches things, it can allow for improvements in the speed of which commands can be run, and with tests, for example. If nothing has changed, then NX knows not to rerun the tests for that library. It can just reuse the old results. But that wasn't the specific appeal for me in this case. What I found useful about this process was that it gave me a systematic way to address the tech debt in my application. I was able to slowly refactor things out into the well-architected structure that NX recommends, and by the time I had moved out almost all of the code from my app into logically separated libraries, the app was much more well-architected and manageable. And you can sort of get a sense of how nicely this is architected within this folder here. If I'm working on something related to articles, for example, I know that all of the UI related to articles is either going to be in this UI folder here, or it's going to be in one of the shared libraries. So although I do find this work useful in its own right, it does still also provide more benefits. So at this point, I'd not bothered to make most of the code generically usable in my other sites by adding it to the shared libraries. My main goal at this point was just to get everything refactored into the library structure in general. But having already refactored into this library structure, it is pretty close to being generically usable in other places. So it's not much of a step to go from what I have in these libraries here to then pulling them out into the shared libraries. And that brings us to the next step, which is the final structure of this workspace. So I embarked on repeating the same process for my next site. I would go through all of the code and start refactoring it out into libraries, but with a bit of a twist this time. So you can see I've created a Josh Moroney folder here now as well. So that's going to hold all of the libraries just specific to Josh Moroney, and it has a very similar structure to Elite Ionic as well. But since I'd already modularized everything for one app so nicely, I found that I consistently ran into sections of this app where I would basically just be duplicating the same code that I already had in the Elite Ionic libraries. So every time I ran into one of these circumstances, I would first see if that component could be made generic enough to serve the purpose for both apps. And often this would mean perhaps passing in an additional prop to configure a path or something, but sometimes no changes were needed at all. So at this point, I would simply move the component from whatever library that it was in Elite Ionic, and I would move that out into the shared library folders. So say, for example, I might have a articles UI component that I wanted to move. So I might come in here, for example, and this is already refactored. So we're actually looking at the stuff that I decided to keep unique to Elite Ionic. But one of the ones I did move, for example, was the author component that displays the author for a blog post. So what I'd do basically is just cut that out of there. We'd go over to the shared folders instead, And I still just have this UI library as well, but now it's split out into multiple different grouping folders. So now if we go into this general folder, we take a look at this library, we can see that I've moved the author component here. And now that it's in a shared library, that means that both Elite Ionic and Josh Moroney can use that same component. So at the end of this process, I had some new libraries which were specific to Josh Moroney. Just like with Elite Ionic, for example, we can see in this UI library here that I have kept just a couple of components, but a lot of the code was able to be moved out into the shared libraries instead. And if we lay the folder structure out side by side, we can see the drastic difference before and after this refactor. And it also allows you to see an approximation of how much code reuse this has allowed for. Everything in the Elite Ionic or Josh Moroney specific grouping folders are just used by those apps. So they're organized, but not being reused, at least not yet. But everything inside of the shared grouping folder can and is being reused by multiple apps. And so that's 2 at the moment, but that'll soon be 3 and likely more in the future. And so the process for refactoring the third app is going to be even cooler. A lot of the shared stuff has now already been refactored out into shared libraries. As soon as we get that second app refactored, we've already identified a lot of the code that is going to be shared among multiple apps. And so my task for the third app and any future apps is going to be a lot easier. I might just occasionally need to add new app-specific libraries or maybe some new shared libraries, but I will be able to reuse huge chunks of code. And I'd also like to point out again that although this reuse is obviously a huge benefit, I still think this structure is worthwhile even if you have a single application. The architectural benefits and tooling are great, and if you ever do need to reuse or publish your code, you're already set up to do that. So it's a very future-proof way of going about designing your application. Okay, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please feel free to leave a like and consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.